This podcast contains explicit language, but it's probably not my fault. Don't worry, I'll talk to the other hosts. Hi, I'm Josh Levin, Slate's national editor, and this is Hang Up and Listen for the week of December 27th, 2022. On this week's show, Kahler of The Athletic will join us to talk about her story on Aaron Rodgers' secret hand signals and how the Packers quarterback reacted to that story. Not well. We'll also discuss the New York Mets mega bucks spending spree, whether it's good for baseball and America. And upon Franco Harris's death last week, we'll look back at one of the greatest plays in sports history, 1972's Immaculate Reception. I'm in Washington, D.C., and I'm the author of The Queen and the host of the podcast 1 Year. All episodes of our 1942 season are out now, as well as the other ones. Also in D.C. is Stefan Fatsis, author of the books Wild and Outside, Word Freak, and A Few Seconds of Panic. Hey, Stefan.
Hey, Josh. How's it going?
Good. Stefan, how are you preparing for TCU's big game on New Year's Eve?
Oh, redecorating the living room in TCU colors. What are TCU colors again? I can't remember.
I see the Hypnotoad in the background and a place of honor in your attic.
I'm adopting a horned frog for the week.
We can get you a flag in there if you want. People can't see. Stefan has a very nice office that he records from, and they could use a little.
The front of our house, which was built in like 1930, has a flag holder on the front porch. So if you get that here quickly, Joel, put it right up.
You don't know why quick? You could keep it up year round.
Joel Anderson, host of Slow Burn Season 3 and 6. This time next week, Joel.
Oof. Yeah, man. I'll be getting.
The world's going to be different.
Getting ready to buy my tickets to the national championship game, probably, or something. So we'll see.
I'm looking forward to having you and Ben Mathis-Lilly on to really hash things out.
Oh man, you bringing that guy on? Get out of here! I'm not doing it.
We'll see if he's available in our Slate Plus segment. Just getting people juiced for TCU, Michigan. In our Slate Plus segment, Kalyn is going to stick around, and we'll talk about a couple of the biggest stories in the NFL this week and stories we've been following all year. Nathaniel Hackett, Broncos coach, finally gets fired, and Tua Tagovailoa, perhaps with another concussion. To hear that segment, you need to be a Slate Plus member. You get bonus segments on this and other podcasts from Slate. You get ad-free shows, and you get to support us. Slate.com/hangupplus, slate.com/hangupplus.
With 2 games left in the NFL regular season, the Green Bay Packers have a losing record, sit in 3rd place in the NFC North, and while they've won 3 games in a row, still need help to make the playoffs. Their veteran quarterback, Aaron Rodgers, is on the way to his lowest QB rating in 15 years as a starter and has thrown more interceptions than in any season since 2010. Rodgers also has at times seemed exasperated with his group of young receivers. As Kahler wrote in a piece last week in The Athletic, it's not easy to apprentice under Rodgers. The quarterback is demanding, and as with every NFL playbook, there's a lot to learn, including an array of line of scrimmage hand signals that Rodgers can change seemingly randomly. Kalyn is here now. Welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me, guys.
And congrats on your new job with The Athletic.
Thank you so much. It's been a fun season so far.
All right, before we get to the unserious response from Rodgers and his water carrier, former punter Pat McAfee, let's talk about the piece itself, Kalyn. I love this kind of story, athletes explaining some small detail that illuminates their sport's complexity, in this case, how NFL quarterbacks communicate with receivers and the challenges that can pose. How did you start reporting the piece?
Yeah, so I started off with basically the question of why were the rookie receivers in Green Bay struggling? Because up until week 10, they really were. They started the season with a dropped pass. It would have been a very long touchdown pass, literally on the first offensive play of the year at Minnesota. And obviously that's a small sample size, but the struggles kind of continued from there. And you could see communication problems. Rodgers during training camp had said a couple of things about the receivers needing to run the right routes. And he was specifically addressing the rookies, the young guys. And this season in Green Bay was very unique because Davante Adams, who had been with Rodgers for so long, the elite receiver that he was, the two of them had such a unspeakable, like they didn't need to talk. They could just kind of look at each other and they had a connection that was totally unmatched in the NFL. He was traded to the Raiders, so he was gone. And this kind of left a huge hole in the Packers offense. And in Rodgers' career, he really hasn't had to rely on rookie receivers in the way that he has had to this season. So I wanted to kind of explore what it is like to be a rookie with him in particular. And I didn't really, extend the story to other teams. This was just a Green Bay story. So I'm sure if you looked at what it's like to play with Tom Brady as a rookie, or Peyton Manning, I know was kind of notorious for being pretty hard on young players as well, you might get a similar result. But that's the question I started out this story with. So I started reaching out to first some players who had recently been cut but had been on the team in Matt LaFleur's and Rodgers era. And I specifically wanted to stick to, the last 3 or 4 seasons with Matt LaFleur, because I didn't want to go too far back into the past, since this story was supposed to be about like what's happening right now. And what I found was, a couple of the players told me Rodgers seemed a little bit unapproachable, that they didn't feel comfortable speaking to him about, non-football conversations. And even when it came to football conversations, they felt like he had his clique, his guys that he's close with, David Bakhtiari, Randall Cobb, Mercedes Lewis, really older players at the Packers that he has a very established relationship with. So that was one thing that kept coming up. And then another thing that kept coming up when I was asking these guys, why is this offense so hard to learn when you're coming from college offense? Like, what is it about this offense that's so difficult? A lot of them brought up the signals aspect of this offense, which when Aaron is at the line of scrimmage, and if anyone's watched him play, you've noticed this, whether you've really consciously noticed it or not, you've seen him do it. He will do, different variations of hand signals at the line of scrimmage to signal to his receivers that something is changing. Either their route is changing, the whole play may be changing, but these hand signals, sometimes they're meant for just one guy, sometimes they're meant for everybody to know, and you'll see them kind of repeat the signals down the line. And these young players that I was speaking with, I kept hearing again and again that these were hard to learn because they're never officially taught to them, because you want to keep your competitive advantage. You don't want to teach these too early during training camp when you're going to cut half the roster. So they keep these signals kind of close to the vest and guarded, and there's no like film cut up where you can just watch them all in a row and sort of review them in that way. You have to learn them from watching Aaron in practice or watching him during games. And then every Saturday they have meetings where they review them, and players will be called up to the front, 3 or 4 each Saturday, and they will do the signals on command and get corrected. And that's just kind of part of the process there. And so the players kind of described those meetings as nerve-wracking and things they didn't really enjoy, but that was how they sort of teach them the signals in Green Bay. So that was what I found. And it kind of explained a lot as to how the transition is just difficult to be a rookie with Aaron, because his standards are so very high. And he's also never really found himself in a situation like this where he needed to get rookies up to speed like instantly.
So, Kelly, you basically created your own access in the story, right? So by reaching out to players that had been cut and therefore not affiliated with the team and thus have, no reason to be, to not talk with you. But you've been in the business long enough to know when players are comfortable talking about somebody or something. And these players are in a really vulnerable position. They're guys sort of on the fringes of the league, but for like, the Randall Cobbs or whatever, right? How did they talk about Aaron Rodgers? Because they said that he was unapproachable, but it seemed like they were wary of crossing him or saying anything that might, get his attention.
Yeah. And I honestly, when I filed this story to my editor, I was like, I don't think I have much here. This isn't, this is fine. There's some interesting details, but it's nothing that's going to shake up the NFL world. I really was like, this is just completely, there's nothing here, because as you mentioned just then, I totally agree with that. When I'm reaching out to players like Amari Rodgers and Kalyn Hill, who were cut in November, they were very careful, and Jay Sternberger as well, who was cut last year. They were very careful to not cross a line of saying that Aaron is that they didn't like Aaron, or, that something he had done affected them negatively. Like, none of them really went there. They just were kind of describing how it's difficult to learn things and how things are done there without really putting any sort of, verdict down on Aaron, saying he's a bad leader. Like, no one said he was a bad leader. Nobody said, anything explicit like that, which is why I was so surprised that the story had the reaction that it got, because I was just like, this is not even, there's been a lot worse said and written about Aaron Rodgers than what anyone in this piece said. And my reporting process was first reaching out to guys who had recently been there so that I could get a sense of what the story was. And then I went to Green Bay to do open locker room for one session there. And then they came and played at Chicago, which is where I live. And so I doubled back and got some more guys after the game in Chicago. And so I sort of paired it with, former recently cut players with current players, just to kind of give it a little bit more of a credibility of people who are in the locker room now. And I think the most interesting thing that I got out of this was from Jordan Love, who is the backup quarterback. He's been there for 3 seasons. This is the player who is closest in position to Aaron Rodgers. And he backed up everything that these former players said about the signals. He said, they aren't written down. He was like, it's just in our brains. That was his direct quote. And then the thing that he said that I thought that was the most interesting is he said, I'm reading from the story right now, Aaron will bring signals back from 5 or 6 years ago that he used to have in an older offense, Love said. He'll just signal it out there and you just kind of got to know. And if you don't know, you just have to figure it out. It's hard for the young guys. So Jordan Love, the backup quarterback, right there is saying that Aaron will whip out a signal that no one actually knows because nobody was on the team then. So if that doesn't tell you what it's like to be a rookie on this team and the level of things you're just supposed to figure out on your own, I don't know what would. That's his backup saying that.
So let's listen to what Rodgers' response was on the Pat McAfee show. There was an extensive response, but let's listen to perhaps the most quotable version of Rodgers' response. Let's listen to that.
It is by far the dumbest nothing burger article that I've read in the entire season. I won't say in my career, because last year there were some of the dumbest articles you possibly imagine. I don't know if you ever topped the COVID to a Wall Street Journal, but this was the dumbest article of the year by far.
All right, Kalyn, I hope you've gotten a plaque or trophy engraved with that statement.
I need to.
On it.
I really need to.
I read the story, obviously. I listened to McAfee and Rodgers talk about it. And it was interesting because the story that they were talking about existed in some parallel universe where it had some similarities to the story that you actually wrote and some that seemed just pulled out of nothing, claiming that the story was just based on anonymous sources when you just walked us through all of the dozens of people that you spoke with. And also, I guess, alleging that the entire thing was made up or fabricated or blown up and not actually reckoning with the fact that current and former players, including the guy who's in the quarterback room with Rodgers, basically backed up the whole thing. And so I guess I'm just curious what you thought of his response, because there's been a couple of iterations of Rodgers on the McAfee show. He's most known for going on there to talk about vaccines and compare himself to Martin Luther King and kind of everything that came out during his whole COVID heel turn. But I was just looking back at Brian Curtis's piece in The Ringer before that, and there was a moment when it was kind of, and Brian wrote a really good piece about it, McAfee and Rodgers kind of reinvented the quarterback show. And they would talk in detail about things exactly like this. Brian references, they had a conversation about how does a receiver signal to you that he made a catch out of bounds and it would get overturned on replay review. So we need to hurry up and get the snap off. And so they do have conversations or have had conversations about this. So I'm just curious what you thought of the way their conversation about your story went.
Yeah, I think it made me sad because Not because my feelings are hurt. I think it's actually hilarious that, Rodgers responded in this way. And like, whenever he does respond in this way, I think it's because there's a lot of truth to whatever was written. And he's like, his response told me a lot about my story. Because as I mentioned to you guys, I really didn't think this was going to make waves. I didn't think I had anything controversial here. And now I'm like, well, damn, like I should have done more on this because of his reaction. But I think I was sad with the whole way that they talked about it on the show, because as you mentioned, they have had some really interesting football conversations on that show where you can learn a lot from how MVP quarterback like Aaron Rodgers sees the game. And I do think he has a lot of really valuable insights on the game that a lot of us would find interesting. And this topic in particular would have been awesome for him to actually discuss. And I can see why he wouldn't want to for competitive advantage reasons, giving away exactly how they use signals, exactly how many they have, exactly how they're taught. I can see why you might be guarded about the specifics of it. But
the angle of your story was, it wasn't an attack on him, but it was it was negative in that it's about how rookie receivers are struggling. It's about how some of them find him unapproachable. Like I can understand if you're as thin-skinned and sensitive as he is, that you would like see it as a personal attack and not want to engage, not want to give it any credence. Say, oh yeah, they do have a point. I am unapproachable.
Right. And if you're as defensive as he is too, I mean, just think about it. This is a guy who's estranged from his family and, he's had all these other concerns. So I kind of can understand why he'd be sensitive, because if you want to look past it, Kalyn, right, you can say you're looking at people saying, hey, he's difficult to deal with. And I go back to this quote that you have in here from Romeo Dobbs, who says, I don't know. I don't know if I've earned his trust. Well,
yeah.
Isn't that Aaron Rodgers?
This is the current player.
Yeah, the current player.
Right.
Yeah.
I think you're actually underplaying, like, I mean, when you're in a story, sometimes, I mean, we all have experience with this. You don't know what's going to hit and what's not going to hit. But I was surprised or impressed that you got this many non-anonymous on-the-record quotes.
It's like a dozen
from
people
players
you talked to.
that were kind of critical of him. Like, it's not like they were over the top or anything, but like to get these guys are really guarded, to get players to say anything that could be mildly construed as negative is kind of a reporting coup.
Yeah, the Romeo quote was really interesting because I was kind of waiting for like the scrum to dissipate around him, because this was the first day that he had come back to practice after 4 weeks of an ankle sprain, I believe. And so I was like, all right, I'm only going to get like 2 questions with him, because he'd been talking for a long time and he's not very talkative. So I was like, he's not going to want to talk to me for long. So I was kind of like, what do I need to ask him? And I'm like, I guess the most important question is like, this was week 13, I believe, when I was there. It's like, okay, it's week 13. Like, do you think you've earned Aaron's trust yet? And his answer of, I don't know, was like so telling. So that was really interesting. And then Randall Cobb saying, I didn't ask Randall Cobb specifically about the signal stuff, because I had no idea that was what was going to take fire. And I was like kind of looking at the story as a whole. And I saw Cobb a little bit as like Aaron's stand-in, because they're like best friends. So I was thinking, whatever Cobb says is like, this is probably going to be Aaron's point of view coming through here. So Cobb, when I asked him, when Cobb was a rookie, Aaron was in his 4th year as a starter. I said, was he as intricate and his expectations as high now as he was then? And Cobb said, yeah. And that's why I didn't play as a rookie. And if you look at Cobb's stats when he was a rookie, I mean, I think he was averaging like 7 snaps per game. And he had 25 catches as a rookie. Like, he was really not a part of the Packers offense that year. And his perspective was because he wasn't ready for it. He was not ready to be a contributor in that offense because it was so hard to learn.
And that's not atypical in the NFL or on a college team, as Joel can back up. I mean, rookies come in and there's a mentality among coaches and veterans who are not sort of emotional intelligence experts like apparently Aaron Rodgers, that are not nurturing leaders, to try to break down rookies before building them up. It's like a test. Can you remember all the signals, kid? It's going to be on the exam. We're not going to hand this to you on a plate. And that might be what's going on inside the locker room and inside training. The reaction part, I think, is more about how Aaron Rodgers has evolved as a personality and as a media figure and someone who now appears to be sort of a perpetually disgruntled conspiracy weirdo. And the most telling line in the Pat McAfee interview, Rodgers doesn't say, "I read the story." He says, "I was made aware of the article."
Yeah. Personally, I actually do think he read it. Pat admitted that he didn't read it. So we know he didn't read it until the second day on his show when he did his dramatic read aloud.
He read every word of the piece aloud, right?
And then, he stopped right before the Jordan Love quotes.
Oh.
Coincidence? Probably not. So anyways, we know Pat didn't read it. I actually do think Aaron read it because if you listen to Aaron's answer, which you guys might play later on, when he actually started to address some of the things in the story, he actually specifically addressed 2 or 3 things that I had written into the story, which is that Jordan Love leads the signal meetings. And he basically confirmed the story, so
let's play that clip now.
Yeah.
Let's play the clip now.
So the way we do it now is that Jordan makes up a list of the signals that we're going to have that week that are possible. And then he calls. I've allowed him to do this. I used to do this when I was a backup as well. And he calls like 3 or 4 guys up there to go through, and he picks on one of them. Hey, what's the signal for this? What's the signal for this? And it might be nerve-wracking the first time you do it, but listen, every signal that's used in the game is probably used in practice that week. And there's hardly any signals that are ever, it's not like there's that many signals. There's some signals in the 2-minute. I think the entire season we've maybe missed 1 or 2 signals on the year for the entire season. So it's not hard at all.
Yeah. So in that clip, he says Jordan Love, that was my reporting. He even, the fact that he used the word nerve-wracking tells me that he read it, because that was a player's quote, was that those meetings are nerve-wracking. So Aaron's problem is not that this story is incorrect. His problem is that he doesn't think it should be a story because this is the way he's always done it. But he's not realizing that this offense could have been better by week 3 if they had made it easier on the rookies, which I don't think they did anything to make it easier on them this year, at least not from what I'm hearing from guys who are in there.
Yeah, and Stefan, you mentioned that it's kind of a common scenario here in a lot of ways that, making guys earn it, wanting to kind of break them down to build them back up. There's also an emerging trend in the NFL in the last few years of guys like Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase, and even guys who didn't go to LSU coming into the league and immediately being like the best receiver in football. So, and Watson on the Packers, I don't know if something clicked. He learned the signals in week 9 or something. I don't know, but he looks like one of the best receivers in football now too. It's a position. It used to be running back, Joel, where guys could come in to the league and just immediately start trucking people. But like receiver now is, and especially because receivers are so expensive to sign in free agency, there's like a huge opportunity cost if you don't have like guys, receivers on rookie contracts who are coming in and like ripping shit up.
Yeah, obviously that is an increasing trend. And the one thing that I think about, though, kind of to put a button on this, is that Aaron Rodgers is asking us to believe in his credibility over yours, Kalyn. Like, this is the immunized guy. You know what I mean? Like, he wants us to pretend that we don't know what his record is over at least certainly over the last year or so. So that on its face, that must feel really offensive to you.
Yeah, I mean, I just take it with a grain of salt. I mean, I thank him for the extra publicity for this story, because certainly I did not think it was going to be like a 7-day lifespan, but it really did become that because it came out on a Friday. The following Monday, Christian Watson missed a signal on that final drive, which is hilarious to me that they bring that up on the show, and then somehow refute the story, even though the evidence was right there in front of us. And in his post-game interview, he said to Lisa Salters, on the field, he's like, run the right route, if you want to catch touchdowns, run the right route. So, that is just kind of, it doesn't really make sense to me. But yeah, I mean, I thank them for the extra publicity because this story definitely had a way longer lifespan than I thought it did. And I think it's definitely worth paying attention to as their season keeps going. And, I wouldn't be surprised to see them make the postseason, which is not what I expected, but here we are.
Kahler is a senior writer for The Athletic, covering the NFL. She's going to stick around for the bonus segment where we'll talk a little bit more about her piece on Aaron Rodgers and get into some other NFL news. Kalyn, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Coming up next, we'll talk about Steve Cohen, the owner of the New York Mets, and his gargantuan new payroll.
Hang Up and Listen is brought to you by Progressive. What's one thing you'd purchase with a little extra savings? A weighted blanket, smart speaker, that new self-care trend you keep hearing about? Well, Progressive wants to make sure you're getting what you want by helping you save money on car insurance. Drivers who save by switching to Progressive save more than $700 on average, and customers can qualify for an average of 6 discounts when they sign up. Discounts like having multiple vehicles on your policy. Progressive offers outstanding coverage and award-winning claim service. Day or night, they have customer support 24/7, 365 days a year. When you need them most, they're at their best. A little off your rate each month goes a long way. Get a quote today at Progressive.com and see why 4 out of 5 new auto customers recommend Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National annual average insurance savings by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2020 and May 2021. Potential savings will vary. Discounts vary and are not available in all states and situations. Last Tuesday, slugging shortstop Carlos Correa was scheduled to appear at a press conference in San Francisco to celebrate what ESPN's Jeff Passan reported was the 4th largest guaranteed contract in North American pro sports history, a 13-year, $350 million mega deal with the Giants. But that didn't happen. First, reports that the press conference got postponed because of an unnamed medical concern. Then overnight, there was a stunning reversal. Correa was going to the New York Mets for 12 years and $315 million. The priciest acquisition in owner Steve Cohen's $800 million plus spending spree this offseason. But wait, another maybe less stunning reversal. The Mets now have their own medical concerns, and like the Giants, they're worried about Correa's lower right leg, which he broke way back in 2014. By the time this podcast comes out, the Mets could have renegotiated Correa's deal, or his agent, Scott Boras, might have struck a new contract with some third team that 4 days from now will develop its own concerns about Correa's leg. Stefan, the amount of money flying around here is large, especially considering that Correa's shin is apparently made out of balsa wood. And Scott Boras, who you covered pretty extensively for the Journal, is unsurprisingly at the center of this whole scenario.
Yeah, I think actually that Correa's right fibula is made of metal because surgeons installed a plate in there after he fractured it after hitting an RBI triple. And his spike stuck on third base during a minor league game.
He got the RBI. It was all worth it.
It was all worth the RBI. He got it. Yeah. I assume that, look, Correa's been in the major leagues now for 8 years and has been paid a substantial sum of money. The Minnesota Twins, whom he went to last year and opted out of a 3-year contract to go on the free agent market, didn't seem to have that many concerns because they offered him a 10-year contract too that he spurned to go to the Giants and then went to the Mets. So one has to think that some doctors looked at this and said that after 8 years, there could be problems coming down the road with his lower leg that maybe could affect his speed, his mobility. Who knows? But it is kind of interesting that 2 teams have chosen to back out of signing one of the prime free agents who are on the market this year. And it is not at all surprising, as you said, that Scott Boras is at the center of this. He is, I think, arguably the most responsible for the rise in player salaries over the last 2 decades plus. He has been a staunch advocate for players and for the belief that owners have the money to do this and the money should be going to the players. The way that he got Correa to the Mets is kind of hilarious. You know, he heard from the Giants that they were backing out. he called Cohen, who was in Hawaii at a restaurant, sipping a martini, according to the New York Times. And Boris said, I asked him if he had 3 olives for a third baseman. Money doesn't really matter to Steve Cohen, as we will discuss. And that's how he ended up signing this contract. And the issue for Cohen and the Mets now is that because Cohen decided to go brag to the New York Post about the signing before the deal was done, they could be on the hook here with no easy way out like the Giants had.
Well, Joel's just happy that the Astros got some good years out of Correa before his leg fell off.
We used him up and have discarded him, and now that's Minnesota, possibly the Mets problem. I think one of the things that was most stunning to me is that it implies to me a lack of sophistication around some of this, that not only would Steve Cohen get out there and talk about it before the deal was done, like that just seems like bad business practice. I can't imagine that somebody that is this successful of a businessman would ever conduct himself in a similar way in other.
Yeah, because when you have, proprietary information like that, the last thing you want to do is go blabbing, right?
Yeah. And I mean, the other thing that sort of shocked
what my
me
colleagues are alluding to here is the $1.8 billion fine that Cohen's SAC Capital Advisors was asked to pay because of pleading guilty to insider trading.
I mean, a good, well-known fraud. But anyway, the other thing about this, though, too, is the idea that teams don't know a lot about physicals until, they've already got the guy in the team. And look, I'm all for protecting people's medical information. I just think it's really sort of stunning where in football, the understanding is, especially when you enter the league, it's all out there for everybody. And a lot of times you'll see a guy fall in a draft, not get drafted at all, whatever, because of something that has come up in their medicals. And I'm just sort of surprised that at this level in Major League Baseball, that the Giants and the Mets didn't get access to this information until that late in the game. It just seems like they were the contract talks were so advanced. They're already being thrown about. There's expectations in both cities, San Francisco and New York, that they're going to sign this guy, one of the top free agents in the game. And they didn't have all their information. It just seems, I don't know. I guess I'm a little surprised at how unsophisticated it is. But Josh, this is the team you root for, so maybe you're used to this sort of.
I think Mets fans are not used to the Mets acting like the Yankees, and I think all of baseball is not really used to it. We'll get to that in a second. But yeah, I was surprised and interested by that too, Joel. I think you hit it exactly right. That there is a logic to it. That in the free agency process, what you're going to have access to are notes from doctors that are curated by Scott Boras, that are curated by the player's agent, and will put everything in the best possible light. And that the physical done by the new team isn't conducted until the deal is done, which is strange. But again, it's not easy to think of what a better system would be. I mean, I guess that the Players Association and the agents would never agree to it, but you could certainly imagine that at the beginning of the pre-agency period, there would be some process where some third-party, independent, neutral doctor just checks all the players out. Again, the players would never agree to that. There would be some logic to that too. Yeah. But let's talk about the Mets, Stefan, and I'm curious for your perspective as somebody who is a Yankees fan, followed kind of how the George Steinbrenner Yankees caused conniptions across Major League Baseball and owners talking about how it wasn't fair and they were, breaking the game and, whining. And you see a lot of this whining around Cohen and the Mets now.
Yeah, it's normal. And it's also in a lot of ways logical, and it's also illogical. And the normal part is that owners feel pressured when payrolls go up in baseball, particularly in the absence of a salary cap. Other owners feel like they now are on the hook for the next guy, that the market gets recreated every year with every enormous contract or every record-setting contract. This is all, of course, good for baseball, as Billy Beane pointed out a long time ago, that having a Steinbrenner or now a Steve Cohen increases attention on the game. It creates a villain. It creates rivalries. And as Bean also was well aware, spending outlying sums of money on a roster is not a guarantee of success. The Yankees and the Dodgers have spent more than anybody over the last 15 years. And they have, I think, over the last when did the Yankees last win? 2009, the last 12 years, 13 years, and they have one championship between them. So Steve Cohen is just the latest iteration of the all-in owner, and who in the offseason creates an expectation that the team will be the favorite. And the money here is ridiculous, obviously, as an outlier, even by Steinbrennerian standards. The Mets payroll could exceed $400 million if Correa ends up with the team and if they make a couple of more additions before spring training or before the season starts. And his luxury tax bill alone will be over $100 million and more than, according to Buster Olney of ESPN, more than the payrolls of 10 to 12 other teams in baseball.
Joel, the luxury tax is known within the game as the Steve Cohen tax. It was put in specifically to constrain him. And Evan Drellich and it has not constrained him at all. Evan Drellich of The Athletic got a really good quote. This one was actually an anonymous quote in The Athletic, if we're keeping score, from an official with another major league team who says, "There's no collusion, but there was a reason nobody for years ever went past $300 million. You still have partners and there's a system." So what this anonymous person is saying, there's no collusion, but actually there is collusion.
Gentleman's agreement.
And it reminds me of the conversation around Joe Lacob and the Warriors about how the other NBA owners are upset that they're paying so much money for their team. But also, Joel, it reminds me of like any realm in which there's like a nouveau riche person who's like splashing around all this money, and the other rich people are like, "Oh, that's gauche, and that's not how things are done here in our club. Like, we are all partners. We're trying to beat each other, but we're not trying to beat each other in this way."
Right. I think Scott Boras actually said something that I agree with, and I'm a Scott Boras fan because I'm not sitting on the opposite side of the negotiation table from him, probably. But he said something about our game needs Goliaths. Mm-hmm. Steve is a Goliath. And I'm inclined to agree. Whether it's the Dodgers or the Yankees or the Astros, who are in the nation's fourth largest city and sixth largest market, I think it's fascinating. And I think it's better when the big market teams are out there trying to win. I remember when, it's funny you mentioned that, Josh, about like the all-in owners. Do you guys remember a generation ago when Mark Cuban and Dan Snyder were touted as new young billionaires so committed to winning that they would stop nothing to do it? And they'd figured out all these ways to brand their team, make money on the edges, charging to go to training camp, things like that. And there was this concern that they were going to be able to figure it out and be such a free agent destination and do it all. And how many, since Snyder entered the NFL in 99, Cuban came in 2000, they've won one total title. So a lot
extremely unfair of you to compare Mark Cuban to Dan Snyder, by the way.
Well, because I remember they were just like the young tech guy, the young guys coming into the club and breaking up this.
Right. Who earned their money in a way that nobody really understood.
Right, exactly. And that's sort of Steve Cohen to me. And I think the other thing that I think about, and maybe I can make another bad analogy here like I do every week across sports, this sort of reminds me of the Clippers versus Lakers in LA, in that like the Yankees are the old family-owned franchise that had all the success, all the branding luck, all that good stuff. And then all of a sudden, like Steve Ballmer, all these Steves, Steve Ballmer comes in, pays this record amount for the Clippers, and he's been driving them ever since. And he hasn't, obviously they haven't won a championship, but they're a lot more relevant than they used to be. And I can't see how this is a bad thing. Like, the owners can't make me care that Steve Cohen is spending all this money.
Well, I don't know if he actually believes it, but Hal Steinbrenner has echoed exactly what you said, Joel. He says this is good for the game. This is good for New York. It's good to have a rivalry in this way. And it does kind of upend the traditional Mets-Yankees relationship of the kind of big brother, little brother, scrappy underdog, versus traditional power. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the city and on the field. But the thing that is so different here, kind of expanding out beyond New York provincialism, is that we were having conversations for the last 2-3 off seasons, Stefan, about how the free agency system was broken, that there weren't any contracts being signed, that it was dragging out into spring training, that guys were hitting free agency so late that they weren't really being able to capitalize on their market value. And Ben Lindbergh in the Ringer had a good piece kind of explaining what's changed here. Stefan, I don't know if you want to walk through that as we close, but it's dramatically different storyline in just like a year where we're having, it's obviously not just Correa, it's Aaron Judge with the $360 million contract. It's Max Scherzer and Justin Verlander with the Mets, who have $43 million annual average value deals. So it's very different than what was happening a few years ago and what we thought the trend was going.
Yeah. And the trend also was toward shorter contracts, and we're seeing some really long contracts in this offseason. But what we should never forget is that revenue continues to go up. The money does exist, and owners should be spending it. MLB has a new media rights deal with Fox, ESPN, TBS. That raised the amount that they're getting by like $250 million a year. There are streaming deals now with Apple and Peacock.
Big contracts always follow big media deals.
They
and
absolutely
also
do.
That big Peacock money coming in.
And baseball also added more teams to the postseason, and so much of its revenue is generated by postseason. So this is, go back and read John Hellier's brilliant book, The Lords of the Realm, about the owners and money and contracts. And you will understand how this is just history repeating itself, just with more zeros at the end of contracts.
It also sort of reminds me of the teeth gnashing around NIL deals or whatever. Every player in the MLB is not getting this sort of money. We're talking about a relative handful of players that are in range of the sort of deals that Correa and all the other people are getting, or the Albert Pujols guys. And usually there's some sort of reason for it, like whether it's an opportunity to make a splash or a name, or they really are, Bryce Harper, young and in the prime of their career. So
that contract's working out.
Yeah, right. I wonder who they lost to. I wonder how that all worked out for them. But the thing is too, is I think about this, like the Deshaun Watson deal, it pissed off NFL owners, right? They were like, man, well, how dare you guarantee all this money to that guys? But it doesn't have to reset the market if you don't want it to. It didn't for Kyler Murray, right? I don't presume that Lamar Jackson is going to get all of his money guaranteed in that way. So, teams can do what teams can find ways around this sort of thing.
But it's the overhang, Joel. It's the fact that there is some security now in baseball because they just signed a new collective bargaining agreement. It's that you can push out the value of contracts longer over time by extending them to 10 or 12 years because you can afford it. Owners would not be doing this if they could not sustain these payments. And that's the thing that forever in baseball gets lost when there is a new record-setting contract or what seems to be an irrational contract. So, like with Aaron Judge, Josh, you were saying that that's going to be a bad deal in 10 years or 12 years. Yeah, it probably will, but it doesn't really matter to the Yankees because of the way it was structured and the value that they will derive from it now and the amount of revenue that they generate so that they can afford it.
It'll be a bad deal in 4 years. Up next, Franco Harris and the Immaculate Reception.
Reboot your credit card with Apple Card. Apple Card is the credit card created by Apple. It gives you unlimited cash back every day on every purchase, up to 3%. And you can use that cash right away. No waiting and waiting for rewards. Just daily cash you can use right away on anything. Apply now in the Wallet app on iPhone and start using it right away. Subject to credit approval. Daily cash is available via an Apple Cash card or as a statement credit. See Apple Card customer agreement for terms and conditions. Apple Cash card is issued by Green Dot Bank, member FDIC.
Franco Harris, who was in many ways the face of the Pittsburgh Steelers dynasty of the 1970s, died last week at the age of 72. Harris was a burly running back, known more for force than speed. For 13 seasons in the NFL, he kept on plowing forward, gaining more than 12,000 yards on the ground and running for 91 touchdowns. But despite his longevity in the league, he's most remembered for a single play in the postseason of his rookie year, 50 years ago in 1972. Let's listen to the call from NBC's Kurt Gowdy.
Last chance for the Steelers. Bradshaw trying to get away. And his pass is broken up by Tatum. Tipped off. Franco Harris has it. And he's over. What? Franco Harris grabbed the ball on a deflection. 5 seconds to go. He grabbed it with 5 seconds to go and scored.
Let's watch this again.
1 million to 1 odds on this one.
Ricochet out there off of Jack Tatum and into the man of the year, Franco Harris's hands.
Harris's remarkable catch, which may or may not have deflected off of Jack Tatum, we can get into that in a minute, quickly became known as the Immaculate Reception, and it gave the Steelers a last-second win over the Raiders. Current Steelers coach Mike Tomlin recently called it the most significant play in the history of the game, and he's not going out on a limb there. It was number one on a recent NFL Network list of the greatest plays in NFL history. Joel, we've all been watching the footage and listening to that call. What do you see when you hear that call and watch that clip?
Yeah, I've been watching that play pretty much my whole life. It's, like I said, it's number one on that list of NFL's most important plays. And it's not that remarkable. Like if you've watched football, for a long time, you've seen better catches. You've seen maybe even, slightly more dramatic endings, of Hail Marys or whatever. But I think the thing is that I was missing the context for it. I'd never really read about it until this weekend. And so it got me thinking about how your generation, sort of the simple matter of your birth date, can influence or determine your particular lens of the world. Because, probably a lot of kids, people that are 20 years younger than me, might wonder, why do we care about the Packers or the Cowboys or the Lakers or Yankees? Like, they're not champions now. Well, that's how it is to me to hear about the Steelers entering that game as a historical doormat. Like, that was their first playoff win in franchise history. That's not how I knew the Steelers growing up. They were the Steel Curtain. They were the dynasty. I grew up at a time when the Steelers were known as the NFL's reigning dynasty. They had a few down years in the 80s and early 90s, but they've always been there. They've always been sort of this presence over the NFL. Like my dad had a Steelers Scully. We're from Houston. He didn't care about like that, but the Steelers meant something. Franco Harris was my mom's favorite player for some reason. I don't know how that happened. I told her about it this weekend and she's like, oh my God, Franco Harris, So the Steelers have always meant something. And I should just mention, as a Houston Oilers fan, I'd like to mention that the Steelers twice got the benefit of doubt on calls in tight playoff games that led to the development of instant replay. And you can look up 1980 Mike Renfro game in the AFC Championship and learn more about that. But as much as anything, it just represents a certain time in the game to me. And sort of the dawn of the Pittsburgh Steelers as one of the NFL's most reliable, great franchises. I would imagine you feel the same way, Stefan, because they were great, during the run of your, time as a youth, right?
Oh, yeah. I watched this game live. I remember watching this play live. I probably had, football cards lined up next to me, on the rug in the TV room watching this happen. I would say, Joel, though I would push back a little bit on that the play itself wasn't that crazy. The play itself was crazy. The ball ricocheted 20 yards backwards off of a collision between two players, and Harris grabbed it inches from the ground and just kept on, on a sprint. and ran down the sidelines and into the end zone.
The thing that's kind of most physics defying or remarkable about the play is like the volume and force that the ball just like immediately started traveling in the opposite direction.
Which is why, I mean, and this is...
It's unusual. Like you don't often see that.
There have been physicists enlisted to try to determine whether it was possible for the ball to have simply ricocheted off of Steelers running back Frenchie Fuqua's back, or whether it, by necessity, must have been it must have hit Jack Tatum and to ricochet that far backwards toward Harris, who picked it up on the run. And some of the stuff I read too over the weekend about Harris's reaction was really interesting. He said that the reason that he actually was moving down the field, and if you watch the all-22 footage, which apparently was discovered only fairly recently of the play, you see Harris sort of in the backfield blocking, and then he leaks out when Bradshaw is forced out of the pocket toward the right side of the field, and Harris leaks out toward the center of the field and sees the ball over his head, but he keeps going toward the play. And he said that's something he learned when he was at Penn State, that Joe Paterno always yelled at players, run toward the ball, run toward the ball, run toward the ball. And that's what he did.
So the reason that we care about who the ball deflected off of is because of a rule that no longer exists,
Right.
which is that if the ball had hit off of the Steeler, Frenchie Fuqua first, it would have been, I don't know, do you remember what it was called? Would it have been illegal touching, Stefan? It's like it was to prevent offensive players for some reason from like batting the ball to each other.
Right.
Like in order for it to be a legal play, it would have had to have hit off of Jack Tatum, the Raiders defensive back, who always insisted that it didn't hit off of him. Harris has been cagey about whether he caught the ball cleanly or whether it was trapped. And that's the thing, Joel, that is so sort of remarkable about this through our modern vantage, is that we don't know the answers to these questions.
And that's why
and
the
that
play
they didn't know.
Yeah.
That's why it's memorable, right, Josh? It's because we didn't have the benefit of HD replay and a much fatter rule book and people in the and officials in the stands and a monitor on the field and a gigantic, 90-foot wide scoreboard to show the replay. So it's the mystique of it.
So how it played out in 1972 was there was a lot of confusion. The referees huddled. They're reportedly called up to the booth, and there was some NFL officiating supervisor who they consulted with, and they basically decided, in the parlance of our times, the call on the field stands, and mayhem ensued. And there's been controversy about it for 50 years. The way it would play out today, Joel, is the play happens. We get 5 minutes of replays. We get Mike Pereira in the booth saying, well, the thing you need to remember here is that the call on the field, you need indisputable evidence. And it would have just been this kind of thing that we always, this routine. Then you would have had Skip and Shannon debating it the next day.
Oh, that would have been great. I would have listened to it the next day too.
I mean, did that strike you, Joel, of kind of how different the whole thing kind of played out because of the lack of technology and the lack of instant replay?
Oh, yeah. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, as an Oilers fan, you can't help but look at the Steelers and wonder how much of their dynasty was aided in part by just simple lack of technology, right? Which is fine. I think there's something to that. I mean, there is something to the mystique of do you know or do we not know, or a team getting the benefit under these circumstances. So,
do we all agree that it's better that it played out how it did then than it would have played out in 2022?
Well, I mean, I guess there would be none of the mystery, right? It would be a wacky play. But I think the idea that, Jack Tatum is I don't know who it bounced off of. And Franco Harris is cagey, like you said. I
guess we got the version of this, the controversy, and I don't know if mystery is the right term, but with the Tuck rule play, where that was kind of dissected and instant replayed, and we had all the angles, and you could still kind of debate about whether the rule was applied correctly and how that that's the kind of modern version. I mean, it's way less cool.
Bryant touchdown.
Or it's soccer and VAR. Are we far off from a time where rather than just seeing the replay, we're going to have a sort of 3D animation of where the ball actually touches and, who it touches last before it ricochets off. I mean, all of that mystique stuff is what, you're right, created the Steelers and helped create their dynasty. They weren't a good team for decades up until then. And Chuck Noll and Terry Bradshaw and Franco Harris, who was just a rookie, helped redefine the sport in that town. Even though this was the longest among the longest standing ownership groups in the NFL, they went through a lot of incredibly lean years here. And part two of the mystique is the name. We don't often get amazing names for plays or games. And the way that the Immaculate Reception came to be called that was just, again, according to the story, just sort of freak luck. Someone was watching the game and called it at a bar and called it the Feast of the Immaculate Reception. And the guy's girlfriend decided to call the local TV station to tell Myron Cope, the sportscaster.
Delightfully antiquated tale here.
Yeah. And it gets even crazier because...
So you're saying he just didn't tweet it? Like immediately when it popped into his head?
Right. I tweeted it first. And the craziest part is that she calls up the TV station. Her name was Sharon Lavosky. And Cope is actually at the stadium, and they patch his call through to the Steelers equipment room. And he picks up the phone and starts talking to this rando from a bar who has a great name for the play that happened 20 minutes earlier. And he goes on the air and he says it. And history has changed in Pittsburgh.
I think the other thing that is really interesting is that this whole thing kind of exposes the, I don't know about like moral vacancy is going way too far, but like the kind of what rings culture misses. The Steelers didn't win the championship
right
this year. They lost to the annoying undefeated Miami Dolphins. But people both in Pittsburgh, even in Pittsburgh and certainly outside of Pittsburgh, remember this play more than any of the Super Bowl games, more than any of the Super Bowls that they won. And so this does show, Joel, that whether you're a fan of a team or of a sport, the most memorable moments or plays, it's not all like LeBron's chase down block on Andre Iguodala in Game 7. Like there are things that can happen that transcends championships.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm always about that part of it. Like, what are we in this for if not that sort of experience? And I think Jalen Rose actually nailed this at the end of the Fab Five documentary from a few years ago, where at the end he's like, well, okay, we lost the championship game, but do you remember anybody on that North Carolina team? Do you remember the champions that followed? He's like, we built something that still lasts. People still talk about us. And I think that's actually sort of the right way to think about it. Championships are just sort of a matter of circumstance, a lot of luck. A lot of things have to go your way, and they are meaningful to the people on those teams and people that root for those teams. But like, we're in it for the Immaculate Reception shit. Like, maybe we won't always talk about the Josh Allen, Pat Mahomes playoff game of last year, but I remember a hell of a lot more about that game than I do the Super Bowl that followed, right? And actually most Super Bowls. So yeah, no, this is exactly why. And just the name Franco Harris, like there's all this stuff, like it's just so evocative. Like you say his name, you say that moment, and I'm immediately taken back to, that footage, the way the NFL looked at that time.
And it's also part of the marketing of the NFL too. I was 9 years old when this happened. And what do I remember about the NFL from when I was a kid? I remember This Week in the NFL and John Facenda and these slow motion kind of unclear replays of things like the Immaculate Reception. The NFL, this was a moment that was built for the NFL and helped it build its reputation as a cultural force even more.
And it happened to the right person. The way that Franco Harris kind of talked about it with humor and humility, but understanding what it meant to the sport and the people of Pittsburgh. I mean, this detail is in all of the obituaries, but at Pittsburgh International Airport, there are 2 statues of George Washington and of Franco Harris.
I've seen that. Have y'all been to Pittsburgh's airport? Have you ever seen the Franco Harris thing? Yeah, it's cool. Yeah.
And, you know, despite his kind of impassioned defenses of Joe Paterno that were perhaps a little ill-advised towards the end of his life, I think a lot of people had the same relationship with Franco Harris that your mom did, Joel. He was a lot of people's favorite player. And, you know, the support that he had in Pittsburgh kind of to this day, he kind of took that on and had that relationship with the city and the fandom that I think we want all of our sports heroes to have. He just seemed like kind of a genuinely humble and good dude who like understood what people wanted from him and why they loved him and was able to give back to people kind of what they hope to get from him.
I would hope in this next round of eulogies about Franco Harris, and there's a lot, because I did not know anything about him. I did not realize he had never rushed for more than 684 yards in a season in college, right? Like he shared time with a guy named Lydell Mitchell, who was more the All-American at Penn State. So I would love to know more about his career going forward. And I'm sure people will direct us to that and everything. But yeah, man, it's just such a name from a different sort of a time. First of all, a running back that played 13 seasons. It was great. And it only played for 2 teams, you know, played for Pittsburgh 13 of those 14 seasons, man. It's just really a time capsule, and I'm really sad. Like, I mean, obviously you're sad when anybody dies. We eulogize a lot of people on this show, but I guess as you get older and you see a lot of your childhood heroes start to kind of go away, it really hits you a little different.
This podcast is brought to you by Progressive. What's one thing you'd purchase with a little extra savings? A weighted blanket? Smart speaker? That new self-care trend you keep hearing about? Well, Progressive wants to make sure you're getting what you want by helping you save money on car insurance. Drivers who save by switching to Progressive save over $700 on average, and customers can qualify for an average of 6 discounts when they sign up. Discounts like having multiple vehicles on your policy. Progressive offers outstanding coverage and award-winning claim service. Day or night, they have customer support 24/7, 365 days a year. When you need the most, they're at their best. A little off your rate each month goes a long way. Get a quote today at Progressive.com and see why 4 out of 5 new auto customers recommend Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National annual average insurance savings by new customers surveyed who save with Progressive between June 2020 and May 2021. Potential savings will vary. Discounts vary and are not available in all states and situations.
Now it's time for Afterball, sponsored by Bennett's Prune Juice, endorsed by Kenny Sailors, who says it was okay. So Franco Harris, Joel, you were talking about kind of learning more about him and his background. He was Black and Italian. And that was a big part of his...
Mike Tirico.
There you go.
Big Mike Tirico fan. Yeah.
That was actually a big part of his popularity in Pittsburgh. And he was embraced in particular by the Italian community. And there was a group called Franco's Italian Army. Joel, you're raising your arms.
I mean, I got to say, like, reading about that, because I'm so glad you brought this up, because I was just so shocked that... the Italians had welcomed Franco Harris into the family. It was amazing. In the 1970s, it's amazing. A lot to learn.
He had a seat at the dinner table, and there was a story, and we didn't really get into this. I guess I mentioned it in the intro, but there was this really kind of like sad confluence of events here, because Franco Harris was being written about and celebrated because of the 50th anniversary of the Immaculate Reception, kind of regardless of his untimely and sudden death. And so there were kind of articles, and there were celebrations happening and things planned. His jersey was retired over the weekend at the Steelers game. And so there was a story that we'll link to in our show notes about Franco's Italian army, and like Franco going to this pizza shop every year is kind of this tradition that he still upheld. And there's kind of a cool mini NFL films like documentary about the Italian army that came out a while ago that we can then link to as well. It's another one of these things, Joel, that's just like really kind of connects you to the past, that there was this thing called Franco's Italian Army that existed, and was like they had banners, and they would bring like meatballs to the games and all this stuff.
I got to tell you, man, being a Steelers fan seems so damn fun. Have you all ever? I watched a game in a Steelers bar in Dallas maybe 20 years ago. When I tried to convince myself I was going to be a Texans fan for a few weeks. And it just was great. And yeah, you can totally see how this might have happened there. Even though I made the joke about, Mike Tirico and I'm welcoming Franco into the family. It's just really delightful. They really seem like a cool group of fans. If you're a Steelers fan, I want to hear from you, man. I'm just because I was an Oilers fan, we don't have to hate each other, forever. We can let the old times die.
Well, his mom was Italian, and his dad was in the service, and they met in Italy. So Franco was legit.
Oh yeah, he's Mike Tirico for real. Like not even tripping. Like he's real deal Italian, man. Italian stallion.
Stefan, what is your Franco's Italian army?
As we record this, 82-year-old soccer legend Pele is hospitalized in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and his condition appeared to be worsening as family members gathered at his bedside over the weekend, which had me reminiscing about more of my childhood in the 1970s, the 3 years that Pele played for the New York Cosmos when I was a kid. Almost 50 years later, Pele to America remains one of the most audacious moves in sports history. The Cosmos were founded by Atlantic Records executives Amit and Nasuhi Ertegun in 1970. They joined the 3-year-old North American Soccer League in 1971, and they were acquired by Atlantic's parent, the music and movies giant Warner Communications, in 1972 for $25,000. The team's first general manager was an Englishman named Clive Toye, a former soccer journalist. He started trying to woo Pele immediately. The first time was in 1971, where he met the Brazilian great in Kingston, Jamaica. Toye played on Pele's ego. He told him that in, quote, 100 years, the photo on the wall of the man who did it for soccer in America should be his. He also said that for all that Pele had done, he hadn't conquered the world's biggest market. On paper, it was a ridiculous sales pitch. Pele had played in exhibitions with Santos, his team, around the United States before and knew the state of the sport here. The Cosmos drew a few thousand fans a game, playing in small, rundown Downing Stadium on Randall's Island, just east of East Harlem. The NASL was filled with over-the-hill or second-rate European players, plus a few mandatory Americans. Toye, though, had bolder ambitions. In 1974, he went to the World Cup in West Germany to try to recruit players. Pele had won World Cup titles for Brazil in 1958, 1962, and 1970, but he sat out the 1974 tournament because he said he was committed to retiring from Santos, the club that he had played for since he was 15, after the current season. They won $1 million for Dragan Zazic of Yugoslavia, and I don't think he's worth that, Toye told soccer writer Alex Yanis of the New York Times. Not that I have $1 million, mind you. If I had $1 million, I would go after bigger names than Zazic. I would go after Pele. In fact, Clive Toye not only had $1 million, he was already offering it. Toye had met with Pele for 2 hours in Frankfurt, again playing to his ego and no doubt his bank account. Santos paid him $400,000 a year, plus $10,000 per exhibition game. He was once arrested during a tour in Rhodesia because he had $100,000 in cash in a suitcase. He got $200,000 a year apiece from Pepsi and Adidas. But Warner and American corporate sponsors and American television and American stadiums could offer so much more. So when Pele officially retired in October 1974, a few weeks shy of his 34th birthday, having averaged almost a goal a game in more than 1,250 of them, Toye picked up the pace. He met with Pele in Rome in April 1975 when the Times reported, no doubt fed by Toye, that the Cosmos were negotiating to pay Pele, yes, $1 million. A few weeks later, Pele publicly rejected the offer from the Cosmos. It was $4.5 million over 3 years. Clive Toye then flew to Brazil. He and Pele met at a beach resort and then in Pele's offices, where Pele served Café Pele, his branded coffee, the most popular in Brazil. Toye would later say that Pele hadn't rejected the team's contract offer at all. He just wanted 14 small changes, including payment for his apartment in New York and specifying where his kids would go to school. On June 1st, Giannis quoted Toye saying, "I believe I have got through to him what he means to soccer in North America." 2 days later, Giannis reported that a deal worth $7 million over 3 years, $2 million of it going to Pele's taxes, was done. The story ran on page 1. It quoted a flattering recruiting telegram from then Secretary of State and soccer fan Henry Kissinger to Pele, which was probably solicited by Toye. A week later, Pele signed his contract at a news conference at the swanky 21 Club in Manhattan. Around 200 reporters, most from international media, showed up. 2 TV cameramen got into a fistfight. Clive Toye had traveled around 75,000 miles over 4 years trying to land Pele. Massaging his ego all of those years had worked. "You can say now to the world," Pele told the media that day, "that soccer has finally arrived in the United States." If anyone had ever earned his hubris, it was Pele.
Man, that's amazing. And it just sort of reminds me, none of the athletes, I mean, for the most part, no athlete just gets to walk off the stage and it just, there's a tidy, good ending or anything like that. It's just like, there's all this other stuff that might happen, they're selling out or, even just Joe Louis working in casinos and stuff like that. You can make it always seem pathetic in that way, just because of how far they have to come down after their career is over, man. So,
and we will talk about Pele, I think, at length, if he does, in fact, die in the next week or two, or whenever he does, because he meant that much to sports. But there's one person who did die that I mentioned in that Afterball that I wanted to do a quick postscript on here, and that's Alex Yanis, the Times reporter who I quoted a couple times. He died earlier this month at 84. He had a pretty cool backstory. He was born Alexios Giannakopoulos in Greece. He sold newspapers for the International Herald Tribune in Paris. He emigrated to the United States in 1967 and managed, which was really rare for a non-American-born journalist, to join the New York Times as a news assistant. His first byline in the paper was a 1970 story about Manchester United beating Bari of Italy in an exhibition game at Downing Stadium. Yanis covered the start of the NASL and the Cosmos' first home game and all of Pele's career with the team, which was really transformative for soccer, at least while he was around. And when Pele retired from the Cosmos in 1977, after having fulfilled his 3-year contract, Yanis wrote, "At the heart of Pele's game is always a joyful pursuit of the impossible. He has dominated the mythology of soccer as no man before him did." So Yanis was kind of important to me, too, as a kid. I mean, here was a familiar byline. He was one of the reasons that I liked soccer growing up and attended a bunch of those Cosmos games after the team moved from Downing Stadium to Giant Stadium. This was a Greek guy covering soccer in the New York Times, which I read every day, giving the sport regular attention. So here's to Alex Yanis and my childhood.
You said his name with the kind of verve that let me know that you knew him or knew something about him. So it came through. It really did.
Thanks for sharing that, Stefan. That's great. And my question for you before you added that postscript was going to be, how aware were you of the kind of off-field stuff as a kid who was probably more interested in the on-field Pele stuff, but were you actually following the will he or won't he kind of negotiation type stuff, or did Pele just kind of show up in New York and you were like, oh, I want to watch that guy play?
No, I mean, going back to do the Afterball, I went through all of the Times coverage and looked at other coverage around the country. And I knew about this. I mean, the Times covered his recruitment pretty extensively, Giannis and other reporters, and covered his career extensively. So I was super aware of it. What was interesting to me about Giannis is the way that he sort of personally got the Times to increase the coverage of soccer. And there's an obituary written by Ron Blum of the Associated Press, and one of Giannis's children told a story that Giannis had persuaded the Times to let him travel to the 1974 World Cup in exchange for credentials and expenses. And the paper published all of his dispatches and published his story about the final on page 1, which had to have been a first for the Times. And this was Giannis's lead. West Germany repulsed a fierce attack to defeat the Netherlands today in the World Cup soccer final 2-1 and become the champion of the world's most popular sport. Giannis also covered the NHL and other sports for the Times, and he worked there until he retired in 2004. So, yeah, I was completely aware of Pele coming, and it was exciting to me as a 12-year-old.
That is our show for today and our last one for the year. Our producer, thank you, as always, to Kevin Bendis.
The music man. He be putting in on those jams. Give him some props, Josh. Come on.
Thank you, Kevin, for the music. Joel said it better than I could have possibly said it.
And putting the show together and all that other shit too. But the music is nice.
To listen to past shows and subscribe or just reach out, go to slate.com/hangup, and you can email us at hangup@slate.com if you're a Steelers fan and want to have some détente. And don't forget to subscribe to the show and rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. For Joel Anderson and Stefan Fatsis, I'm Josh Levin. Remember Zalmo Beatty, and thanks for listening.